Well, thank you. Thank you to Cool Mine. I was really refreshed and excited having the opportunity to visit Ashley House, to see that wonderful curriculum at work and see children and parents really attaching. And thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Rowdy, for the lovely tribute to Eric, who I think is really missed by many of us at this conference. And how fortunate we all are to be sitting here in this dry, safe room with what's happening in the world between the genocide in Burma and the earthquake in Mexico City and the hurricanes in the Caribbean. How wonderful to have this parentheses where we can have some good conversation and share our perspectives. I'm always so grateful to EFTC for these conferences and so grateful to be able to come. So, post-patriarchal therapeutic community in America, women as culture carriers. In no way does this mean post-patriarchal no men. It means that, at least in America, we have to really move, if we're going to preserve the therapeutic community, into a situation where there's a great deal more equality. I like to look at the therapeutic community that started in the US as a spontaneous combustion, in a way, that it was a revolution of inclusion. Social context in 1958 in the United States, there was a lot going on. The Montgomery bus boycott had just ended. Interracial marriage was illegal. Homosexuality was illegal. Abortion was illegal. The House on Un-American Activities was really raging. There were a lot of people that were blacklisted and had nowhere to go, no place to talk. There was many people who in the 50s had helped form the Golden Guineas Gang, and of course the Hells Angels and the Galloping Gooses. There were signs in the 50s, N-I-N-A in New York, where I grew up, which meant no Irish need apply. My Italian friends were referred to as WAPs, which was without papers. And there were quotas for Jews who were coming into the country. So it was, and we had, blonde movie actresses singing Que Sera, Sera, while all of this, chaos is going on in the nation. So, interesting time. And there were groups of people during that time that were really invisible. There were a lot of women that had gone to work in the Second World War that were pushed back into the kitchen, if you will. There were many military personnel that had lied about their age and had gone to the Second World War when they were 15 and 16. AA was very new. Mentally ill people, there were a lot of anti-nuclear activists, and of course, one of the groups that was really invisible were women of color, and particularly black women. And if you cannot see a group, you really can't hear them. There you go. So Synanon was, the nature of activities, Synanon was formed as literally, it was a spontaneous combustion where people were kind of doing a 12-step group, but it was on a beach, in Venice, and a lot of the people were homeless. And there were a lot of people of color involved. And the nature of activities stated in 1958 that it was formed for the express purpose of research and investigation into the causes of alienation. The result of that was that the Synanon clubs ended up being a place where all these people who were sort of invisible and didn't talk and couldn't have a place to go, movie actors and jazz musicians, would come down and have these great conversations. Sometimes there were more guests at night than there were people in the actual campus living there. And the invisible group, which is rather remarkable, is that they were hosted primarily by a group of black women. And this is a story that doesn't usually get told very much. Certainly Betty Diedrich, Lena Lindsay, Tootsie Cavanaugh, and these were women who had been in mental institutions. Some of them had been given shock treatments for their heroin addiction. Some of them had been put in straitjackets because that's how they did it then. There was one whose picture I don't have here who was experimented on in Lexington, Kentucky with LSD, which was something else that they did at that time. And so these women had been severely traumatized and sort of clicked into this organization and essentially were a lot of the management. Certainly all of them as women and as black women had PhDs in how to make the men around you look good. That's a skill base that many of us have grown up with at different times. But they, in fact, really organized the place, went out, did speaking engagements, and made a significant contribution to the movement, which has really been lost, forgotten about, and perhaps not really noticed. One of them was insisting that there be music and art and many forms of expression other than just the spoken word. If you are invisible, you're not heard. And one of the things that is so striking, and of course I had gone to Synanon as an 18-year-old. Synanon was 12 years old when I got there, and I got there on my 18th birthday. Heroin addict, in trouble, all those things. So I was the youngest person, about 1,000 people on the campus when I got there. So I got to watch a lot of these interactions. And, you know, many, many people came and visited. Many wrote, many published. This group of black women were never really noticed by the outside world, by any person except Abraham Maslow. When Maslow came and spent half of a summer at Synanon, he was absolutely astounded and said that they embodied his axioms of self-actualization, and he was so honored to meet them. The feminine contribution certainly to Synanon faded as the organization became more corporate and misogynistic. So what was the contribution? One of the most interesting contributions was the idea that within the TC, it was very easy to develop a vocabulary of hostility in the encounter circle. So there were circles, which I was blessed to be a part of extended affirmations. So that would mean that, let's say if I was in a circle with George, I might say, oh my God, you know, I'm so excited and proud to hear your new CD, and you're such a good jazz saxophonist, and you always do such a good job playing and collaborating with other people. And then Doug might say, yeah, but wait a minute, you know, do you know that he's supporting his wife who goes and takes care of sick elephants? And then George might say, well, hold on, you guys, let me tell you what's really good about my relationship with my grandson. And these affirmation circles, sometimes they were not short. They might go an hour, they might go 2 hours. The longest one I was in were the 24-hour marathons, just exercising the ability to affirm each other, to find things that we genuinely and truly respected about each other. And let me tell you, it's a very difficult discipline. And it was a very, very interesting experience. And it faded out of the field. The environment was a huge, huge piece. Use what you have, make it beautiful, and that was from public rooms literally into heater closets. And these were the women that taught everyone and set up the environments. Everything was multi-purpose. Probably the largest amount of money that we spent on was making sure everything could roll. So you could change the rooms. The community was supported by the structure, but it wasn't the structure. There was a whole concept about banking character. So if you had, you know, somebody who was a construction worker and somebody who was a Harvard attorney, and remember, there's this huge group of what you might consider, what George might call senior professors that were around the environment and lived in the environment. And there was a concept of, well, how do you bank character? What are the demonstrations that people make? Are they really, truly members of the community? And no matter what somebody's skill base were, no matter how many degrees they had, no matter if they didn't know how to read and write, the membership in the community was really considered prime. The bottoms-up perspective, we were all taught by these women to walk into a room and to look at the room from the perspective of the newest person in the door. You're brand new. What do you see? Who's sitting with each other? Is it integrated? Are people laughing? Did they stop talking when you come in? Is there stuff on the floor? And how did people feel when they got to their first bed? Was there a welcome note, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Going into a place like that, to the Synanon campuses, enrollment was a ceremony. My personal enrollment interview as an 18-year-old with 13 cents, not particularly important person, not connected to anybody important, lasted between 4 and 5 hours, where people who had been in the community, including, you know, some of them were old-timers, some of them were people that were going to be my peers, really took the time to talk to me, to get to know me, to try and figure out what I needed. And that was a life-changing experience, just that first day of enrollment. Many other things, and emphasis on story, 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 story. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. That's from Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was something that was on the reading list. And we've gotten away from story to the degree that we need to be. And we oftentimes paper over the woman's voice and the woman's story, even though we're doing lots of great work with trauma and so forth and so on. That's why it was so important that you shared some of the details of women in prison. And I'm so relieved to come to these kinds of gatherings now, 45, 6, 7 years later, and hear people really talking about the plight of women in prison. It was unthinkable for these women to have a community without children. So by 1960, people were coming in with their children. And as with all the research and everything that's always been done about Synanon, it's always fascinating to me that the books about the school and the books about the children are not anything that ever comes up. And the one gentleman that wrote a book, This School is Made for You and Me, went on, and he's sort of become a national phenomenon with Head Start and everything, writing a book, How to Raise Emotionally Healthy Kids. And that just sort of got forgotten about. There was a lot of play. The idea was liberation into competence, and I remember seeing one woman driving a piece of heavy equipment, sewing her clothes at night, hosting dinner, and there was a real push for all the women and all the men to be competent in so many different ways. So what happened? Many white men who were kind of the dominant group at the time in the 50s and 60s came and visited Synanon, and they heard the white male voice. They literally didn't notice the community from that perspective, habit of the times. People replicate what they are the most comfortable with. So we got sanctions and structure and learning experiences, and those are really exalted. And as the years went by, the ceremony, the acknowledgement, the discernment, and the community as method became more and more demeaned. Interestingly enough, there were a lot of early meetings between, which I've got audio tapes of, between Dan Casriel and the Diederichs and other people in the community about the starting and getting Daytop funded. And then when the Synanon group realized that it was only going to be for male heroin addicts, they pulled out. Because they said, that's not how can you have a community if it's just only men and only men that are heroin addicts and you're not mixing up different kinds of people? Jim Collins, one of my favorite management people out of Stanford, wrote a lot of different books, but he wrote something on the social sector, and he says, we must reject the idea, well-intentioned but dead wrong, that the primary path to greatness in the social sector is to become more like a business. Many widely practiced business norms correlate with mediocrity, not greatness. Why import mediocrity into the social sector? But nevertheless, the TC has worked. It has been fantastic. It's been a movement that I'm very proud to be a part of and grateful to be a consistently learning practitioner of. But what happened in the US is most of the TCs, as they replicated, primarily were run by men, primarily were run by white men, primarily had boards of directors, not like the original Synanon board of directors, which was black, brown, white, educated, not educated, women, a whole mix of people, but really boards of directors that started looking more and more like corporations. The TCs became increasingly known for addiction, not bad, saved thousands of people, but as that began to happen and people kept reinventing themselves for the funding, the social justice advocacy began to erode. And some of the research began to erode, which again, it was such a relief to hear what Coolmine is doing in terms of research. Funding became very government focused. And the equality, the parity between the masculine and the feminine values, the anima and the animus, started fading and fading. I think that the TCs in the United States, and this is they've become agencies. The language of community has consistently sort of fallen away. The language that you hear now is very distancing. The role development has been somewhat diminished. Management has stopped attending community events, and management no longer feels that it is imperative to teach, to be a community member, to be part of the ceremony. There were some TCs in the US, Synanon included, but many others were inappropriate. Transferences were fostered in unhealthy ways with some of the men that were running them. And essentially, if you think about community as a circle, and then the triangle is the corporate structure, the idea would be that the corporate structure is there at the service of the community. And when the community says, oh my God, we've got to figure out how to do something with homeless people because they're all over our community, we've got to, outside the doors, then the triangle has to grow to support that and find ways to do that. And that sort of got reversed in my nation in many places where the corporate structure took over and the community was existing really for a sort of self-feeding, if you will, corporate structure. And you could go to management meetings and people would be talking about funding, and the conversation about the quality of service started fading farther and farther away. And the conversation about community as method and how we improve that, certainly those of us that were at the presentation this morning from Australia, how fantastic it was to sit down and look at a forum that talked about, okay, how do you measure, how do you think about community as method in your place, and what are the fruits of that labor, and how do you implement it, and how do you improve it, and how do you add depth to it? So as the TCs became more corporate in the US, they became more shallow. So these are issues that we struggle with and we're thinking about a great deal. The bottoms-up view completely disappeared from many executive management teams, and language was changed to reflect more medical model language rather than community language. So my premise is that some of the early culture carriers in the TC were really the women, and that we need to move the field forward, at least in my country, by embracing and encouraging and exalting and teaching many, many more women to be culture carriers once again, having responsibility in advocacy, in management services, responsibility to ensure community membership. The pull-up, in those days with all these black women was responsive. It was right out of the black church. It was never written down. Somebody would come up to me and they'd say, Naya, you're going to hurt yourself. I'm going to pull you up the way you're operating that meat slicer. And I would say, thank you for saving my life. And they would say, it's a life worth saving. And just that responsive element kept it out of a power and control, punitive kind of situation, because people kept reinforcing what we were there to do, which is to save each other's lives. If the women that are working in the TC movement in the world today can't be very brave about whatever it is, whether that be incest, whether that be abuse, whether that be, being in Bureau of Indian Affairs schools and all of the stuff that happens in the US in that regard. If we can't be brave and we can't push ourselves to be really brave, what happens to the women in Rohingya? What happens to the women immigrants? What happens to the women that are so marginalized that nobody's trying to figure out a real revolution of inclusion for them? And what happens to our field? In terms of other ways to apply community as method. Because I'm having the same experience that some people are having in Australia, because we work with 12, 15 Native American tribes. And they are so much closer to community. When they come into the CC, invariably they say, this is familiar to me. This is familiar to me. This is familiar to me to have the whole community helping me with my child. And the grandparents come. Oftentimes they don't even speak English. And they say, this is familiar to me, because this is community, and this is what my ancestors taught me. We need community as method everywhere. We've lost it. One of the biggest problems that we're up against in many of our places is that the people have experienced community as method sometimes in an inside-out way. I don't ask men that are coming out of prison, did you ever belong to a hate group? I say, what hate group did you belong to? Because that's how prevalent this is becoming. And I believe that it will be women that will know to ask these kinds of questions in enrollment interviews, because we're not necessarily we don't base our lives mostly on power and control as we're raising our families and as we're negotiating, in various meetings. So there's a lot of stuff in our assessment forms and so forth that we need to start changing in the different communities and cultures to which we belong. We know that it's much easier for men oftentimes to disclose to women. Men's disclosure regarding rape and violence and abuse and all of those other kinds of things helps increase public safety. We work in a lot of prisons with Amity. Our mandate is I want to increase public safety for my community, my state, my nation. We know from a lot of questionnaires that we administered that when we had prison projects that were half men and half women, the men in those prison projects all reported, self-reported, that they felt that being at Amity made them a better parent. And in every single prison project that had 100% male staff, we saw absolutely no difference. They just said, no, I didn't think about my kids while I was here. We know that women report empowerment as connection. We know that women develop morally by being connected to others. We know that women grow up in multiple roles. We know that a lot of people don't have positive community experiences, particularly in the men's community. And we know that we need that in our TCs. You know, you can go almost anywhere in the world, and you know there's that tapestry from The Mask of Anarchy, you know, Shelley, that then goes to Thoreau, and he writes Civil Disobedience, and then it goes, you know, to Gandhi, and then it goes to Martin Luther King. And you can go almost anywhere in the world and say, you know, ye are many, but they are few, and people in countries in different languages know what you're talking about. We don't have that tapestry yet on the planet in terms of women's language, weaving down from Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, through Zora Neale Hurston, through, some of the other great women in the Harlem Renaissance, to, you know, women of today. We need that. We need, as women that work in the TC, to empower our women students and our men as well with stories of women who have been able to overcome the odds, great difficulty, survive, grow larger than what wounded them. We need to honor our own ancestors, which are the women on the planet. So I'm going to leave you with this. Women's work. Through centuries and cultures, certain work has been ascribed to women. The raising of children, the sewing of clothes, the emotional fabric of family, the keeper of secrets, mourners at the grave, witnesses at the crucifixion. There are those women who wait, those who decorate, those who teach. There are those who do not appear in history. Women's work, those who are ever patient, those who are counted on to be there, those who prostitute, those who serve as domestics, those who serve as ornaments, those who bear the chain of childbirth, and those who bear the pain of isolation. There are women whose friendships survive all other ties, and those unable to sustain female companionship. There are women who have raised their voices in sisterhood for themselves and each other. There are those whose silence is louder than any spoken word. There are women who have paved the way by their independence or slavery, setting examples which guide and warn those of us who follow. Some women, liberated into competence, have opened career paths and possibilities for thousands behind. Women who've been the first in their century, their culture, their profession. Women's work, an expression that lives on through centuries and cultures. Women, living longer lives each decade, often surviving all those whom we have loved. Have we as women improved our ability to live with ourselves? The woman's voice, the woman's song. What verses do you add as each year passes? Through centuries and cultures, women have been raped, plundered, beaten, possessed, and discarded to be the objectified spoils of war, women's work. From the Inca priestess to the Bosnian mother to Boko Haram, beatings, battering, and abuse is an undeniable reality. Every conquering army, each raiding tribe took what they wanted and discarded the remains. And women have gathered their broken selves together and stood up when they could or left. The lie about the suicide, an extension of the lie covering the rape. Women's work, mothering children of rape. The face of the rapist stares back from the body of a 5-year-old. Women's work, inventing the story regarding the father. Women's work, to live with nameless experiences, shameful, illegitimate products of abuse not brought to light. Women's work, rationalizing pain or wrapping it, securing the secrets in neat, orderly parcels placed out of the reaches of consciousness. Parcels to be coughed up on deathbeds or found in the ribbon-bound letters in the small box after she's dead. Women's work, creativity. Women's work, the emergence of voice. Women's work, being good ancestors for all of the world's children. Women's work, building the bridges between morality and compassion. Women's work, preserving life, loving our planet. Women's work, to find the rainbow threads of authenticity and weave them together. An honest song with verses of pain and joy, naming and birthing, unwrapping and untangling, taking what is useful and discarding the remains in peace. So may we all open more doors for those coming behind us than were open for us. Thank you.